All right. Hello, and welcome to LA County Library's virtual program, Community and Shared Space. Will be the fourth and final installment in our virtual series of interfaith conversations, which we've entitled Community Care, Libraries and Faith Organizations in Conversation. My name is Katrina Lacerna, and I'm the Asian Pacific Resource Center librarian for LA County Library. And as was previously mentioned, this is part 4 of a virtual roundtable series exploring the intersections between our community that libraries help and faith organizations. These roundtables are inspired by the idea that both libraries and faith organizations provide community care and service. The details of why and how our respective organizations provide services might differ, but we hope to explore and come to a middle ground where many types of community groups can meet in solidarity. So through these interfaith conversations, we've been examining a different aspect of service work. Tonight's installment is entitled Community and Shared Space, and we hope to unpack the significance of libraries and faith organizations' physical spaces, the role that those spaces play in community service, and the way organizations adapt when physical space is not available. But before we do go further, I would like to share a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors and LA County Library. Thank you, Daniel. So the County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Kitch, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue the stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, in no particular order, the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians, Kitch Nation, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Thank you. Also, before we continue with tonight's events, we also ask that everyone joining us tonight acknowledges a set of agreements. The purpose of these agreements is to ensure that we maintain a space and conversation that is healthy and respectful towards everyone. Please note that everyone is welcome here, and we all come here as equals. We come to listen and to learn, not to debate or convince or convert. We come with humility and leave our assumptions and our disagreements behind. We trust each other when we speak because all of our experiences are valid. We will not compare one set of ideals to another's practices, but instead compare ideals with ideals and practices with practices. This is a brave space, and we accept that there may be discomfort. We all accept responsibility for challenging ungracious narratives. So thank you very much for agreeing to those set of agreements. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to tonight's panelists. First, we have Dr. Andrea Humphrey. Dr. Andrea Humphrey is a public speaker, author, and lead pastor of Hope's House International Ministries and the president and CEO of Hope Community Development Center in Granada Hills. Welcome to Dr. Humphrey. And next, we have Right Reverend Alexei Smith. The Right Reverend Alexei Smith is the Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs Officer for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and he previously served as the president of Interreligious Council of Southern California. Thank you for joining us, Father Alexei. And finally, we have Professor Najeeba Syeed. She is the inaugural El Hibri Endowed Chair and Executive Director of Interfaith at Augsburg University and has been a professor in the fields of conflict resolution and interfaith studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Syeed. So many thanks to all three of our panelists for making the time to join us for this conversation. And we can go ahead and get started with our discussion. Again, tonight's topic is centered on community and shared space. So I just wanted to introduce the idea of the third space, which is kind of like the spot in between our work and home, where community members gather to feel safe, relaxed, and accepted, And in tonight's conversation, we'll explore the significance of our libraries and faith organizations' physical spaces and how these spaces are used for community service. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask the panel, what do you think makes our buildings special, and what is their role in our service delivery? I didn't know who wanted to go first. Please feel free to jump right in. You guys are so polite.
Ladies?
I'll call on someone then. Professor Syeed, did you want to share? Again, the question was, what makes our buildings special, and what is their role in our service delivery?
So I think particularly in the Muslim community, the mosque, which is the house of worship, you may hear it referred to as the mosque or the masjid in the word, that's the word in Arabic, or very often one of the oldest mosques in Southern California that has been my mosque that my kids grew up in is called an Islamic center. So you may hear any of those three names, mosque, masjid, or Islamic center. And throughout LA County, we have a really plethora of mosques and incredibly diverse mosques. And I think what is really important for Muslims is that it is more than just a house of worship. The congregational prayer for Muslims is Friday, called Jummah prayer. It's Friday around 1 o'clock. There's a sermon and people congregate. But that's actually not the busiest day at the mosque. The busiest day, for instance, as I was raising my kids, was Sunday. Our kids go to Sunday school because our religious holiday, since America is historically accommodates doesn't accommodate Muslim holidays or practices in the same way. So we often will congregate on Sundays, and so I think the mosque for us is really a place of where, for instance, we did parenting circles. Our children receive religious education. It's the youth center. So we have most mosques, youth are also really present in the community on the weekends. It's where their youth group meets. And many mosques, including Islah LA and Islamic Center of Southern California, and many others, become sites of social work. So my children on Saturday, the mosque that I was mentioning, which is in Koreatown, Islamic Center of Southern California, and Islah LA, which is on Slauson, they open their doors to the community through food pantries. So throughout LA County, faith-based sites have also become sites where people go. And it's not, what's really beautiful about that is while the services on Friday or on Sunday that are oriented to community education, mental health services, community-based education, civic education, not just religious literacy. What's really beautiful is that a lot of the people that come to mosques for food pantries or other forms of social services that are often given out on those weekends, and really every weekend, that those go to whoever's in the neighborhood. So the mosque that I go to in Koreatown, we would often have people who are not Muslim that would come, but they would come and visit the mosque, and we would serve about 200 people, and my children and I would volunteer. So I think that's really a beautiful thing, where it doesn't mean a house of worship just serves for worship. And beyond that, it doesn't serve just one community. It's a neighborhood institution in many ways, like what a public library may be. So I'll let my other panelists share their wisdom as well. Thank you so much.
I'll go ahead and go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So the church in traditional community has always been a place of gathering. Historically, while our church is not intended to be an African-American church, it seems to be who we attract primarily, even though we live in the suburbs where the minority population is extremely small. I think people have a tendency to move towards what they're familiar with, right? And so we have a largely, probably about 85% African-American congregation who drive from all over Southern California to participate in worship. But traditionally and historically, the church has been a place where not only do you find safety, but you find resources, you find help, you find education, you find instruction. I don't know if you've ever seen any award show, but almost any musician and or actor, I want to thank you for this reward. And I got my first start in church playing the drums or doing an Easter speech. And so it's where people have the opportunity to honestly hone their craft as well and fail and still applaud it in some respects and encouraged to get back up again. During the 60s, if you know anything about historically about the Black church, it was a place of safety and refuge during the civil rights movement. Through slavery days, the church was a thing. So just historically, it's been a place of safety, particularly in the African American church, but the church as a whole in America, although extremely divided at the moment on political issues, still for many communities is the place where you can go and find community. You can go. I had children, and in full transparency, I had no idea what I was doing after 14 years of marriage. But it was the women of the church, right, who helped me. I wanted boys. I had girls. I didn't know how to comb hair. And so it was the women of the church who came alongside me and helped me and helped me develop as a woman, as it were, and as a mom. Of course, from a church perspective, there's teaching and learning from our faith about Jesus, about God, about how to love your neighbor, the great commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself, the two greatest things that you could do, and teaching people how to love themselves, because I can't love you, my neighbor, as myself, if I don't love myself. So church historically has been some of everything in our community from a Christian perspective. And as I said, unfortunately, there's a great divide right now amongst political issues, cultural issues. But I'm a firm believer that in the end, love will prevail over all things. So
I would certainly say amen to that. I would certainly say amen. Much as my two colleagues this evening have described, Catholic parishes consist of a church building in which the actual worship takes place, and then a number of auxiliary buildings, such as a hall maybe, or a library, a school perhaps, classrooms. The church itself is normally reserved only for worship services, but not exclusively. Now, I can give you a couple of examples where that's taking place. But the other facilities, such as the parish hall or even classrooms, can be used for any number of community events, and often are. Citizenship classes, for example, where these are conducted not just by the Catholic Church, but maybe by a whole panel, whole array of different people from different faith communities, all working to assist people in obtaining citizenship in the United States. We have here in my own little parish here in El Segundo, opened the facility here for the police department to have examples of how they want to partner and establish neighborhood watches and things like that. We certainly have also here in El Segundo a partnership whereby there are 9 houses of worship in El Segundo. They happen to all be Christian of one ilk or another. 5 of those 9, my own parish included, have formed what we term CASE, a community alliance to support and empower people who are economically challenged right now. So we pool our resources. We've formed a food pantry and such, and we're using the facilities in one of the other churches here in town in order to have this food pantry and such. We're not in their worship space, but we're in their social hall and in one of the unused classrooms. So I think that the churches, mosques, temples should be centers of learning as well as are the libraries. And I think that we can do that in a number of ways.
What I'm struck with when I hear you guys speak about your physical spaces, the similarities between libraries are so striking to me, because I think in the common perception, there's the idea of like, this is what a place of worship is, this is what a library is, right? A library is a place where you get books. But no, we offer so much more, as you mentioned. We do a lot of service to our communities. We provide meals, we provide free access to books and technology and Wi-Fi. And so We even do health screenings, we do vaccination clinics. We really adapt to what our community needs, and very much so, our churches and places of worship are very similar,
Yes.
it seems like. Can you speak on how you adapt to the needs of your communities and the challenges that that comes with? Feel free, anybody can join in.
I could, so unlike perhaps maybe some of the other communities, or similar to some of the other faith communities, Muslims in America are one of the most ethnically, racially, and linguistically diverse communities, and LA County is no exception to that. So for instance, in South LA, we have more than 4 mosques, some of them that have been there for more than 50 years, that are historically African-American mosques. And we have other mosques in the valley that are reflective of a more South Asian heritage from India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. We have mosques that have concentrations of Arab Americans. The mosques that, some of the mosques that I mentioned in downtown Los Angeles have, you know, we have, so the way our community has manifested in its spaces is very multilingual, very multicultural, very multiracial. So it depends on the needs of that community. Sometimes it's a neighborhood community where people come from the local community to the house of worship. Other times there are people will go maybe because of language access. We have a mosque that has served the Thai community along the 210. So it might be that if you are more recently immigrated and your language needs are very high, then you may want to go and be in a community or be around a community with which you have affinity, not just culturally, but language access. And I wanted to mention that in the Muslim community, mosques are really places for civic engagement, learning and acculturating to American systems of democracy, local government. This is a place where, you know, very often the local council member or county supervisor will come and visit. So there's a mosque in Altadena that my kids also, we would go to from time to time as well. So I mentioned just the number of different kinds of mosques. So really briefly, I wanted to mention that we are a very multicultural, multiracial community. So you may go to one mosque and see majority of one culture and community, but then you may go to another mosque and it's a completely different language, it's a completely different ethnic mix. And then we have some mosques that are really centers for people of many different cultures, many different backgrounds, many different languages. And I would say that one of the really innovative things that have grown out of a lot of mosques are specialized services for the community. So for instance, Islah LA, which is in Southwest Los Angeles, now has transitional housing for returning citizens, for people who are transitioning out of incarceration. So transitional housing for those individuals. There has been a proliferation also of community services for people dealing with intimate partner abuse, organization called NISWA that does that work through different mosques around our LA County population. So I think it's important to understand that within the Muslim community, the space is often responsive in many ways to the community that's using it. And one of the things we find is parking lots get used to hand out food, or thrift store. So it's really fascinating for the mosques that I've been to and that I go to, of which there are many in LA County, over 100, that these mosques, every inch of them gets used, because we're, as some mosques are 50 years old, many mosques are newer for recently immigrated communities. So you have this, you know, you may have a mosque that's a storefront that used to be a dentist's office, and it's still working its way through becoming a mosque. So unlike maybe certain churches or Catholic parishes, we don't have one architect that, or one form of architecture, we may be adapting to an old restaurant or an old school. And so we really are very often responsive to the concerns that the community has. And we are a growing community. I wanted to mention really quickly that I mentioned we have a substantial African-American Muslim population, South Asian, Arab, Southeast Asian, and the fastest growing community in Los Angeles is the Latino, and also Spanish speaking Muslim community, which has an organization that really provides language access called LALMA that works through different mosques. But it is very much the fastest growing community around the country, but also particularly Los Angeles has become a center for Latino Muslim culture and language access. And so I didn't know if people knew all that. So that was, I'll pass it off from there.
Yep, much like the Muslim community here, the Catholic community within the Archdiocese of Los Angeles is very ethnically diverse. We have approximately 300 parishes in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. I believe the services are offered and people pray in 40 languages in those 300 parishes. Sometimes multiple languages, multiple ethnicities within one parish. St. Philomena, I know in Carson, I believe they offer the services in Tongan, in Spanish certainly, in Tagalog for the Filipinos, and I believe also in French for the French Creoles people there. And this is reflective, as Najeeba was saying, of the community around them, and their outreach then is multifaceted because you have a multicultural environment in which you're living and serving.
So Protestant Christian churches have an independent quality to them. And I want to frame this really positively. The differences span the continuum, as it were. You have everything from Presbyterian to Baptist to Pentecostal to all the various denominations who all do things very different. And in many ways, oddly enough, believe 98% the same thing, but get caught up on 2% of the difference, if that makes sense. And
makes total sense, believe me.
Yes, thank you. So my church happens to be a non-denominational church, which means we're not Baptist, we're not Pentecostal, we're not Episcopal or anything. My husband and I planted the church out of a Bible study. People just kept coming and it just kept growing. And we finally figured out, oh, this is what God is doing. And so we should probably get on board. And so I say that to say that churches can be very specific to either the denomination and what their heartbeat is, or it can be very specific to the mission for which that particular church was planted, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So for instance, my church has a very transitory element to it. We are in Granada Hills, which is right next to Northridge, which has tons of college students. We started out of a college Bible study. So we have a tendency to have young people at our church. Well, young people have a lot of energy. The music is very upbeat for the most part. And we have on any given Sunday, 1 million children running around because we have families. And so over the pandemic, I want to say we had 15 to 18 kids born in our church. And so now we have under 5. Now we're restarting Moms with Tots because that's the need right now. Whereas before, when we were college students, my husband and I had everybody at our house. We were cooking because they were poor. They had no money. And every time they showed up, they were like, I'm hungry. And so we were more geared towards backpacks everywhere. Now we're more geared towards strollers everywhere as the church has grown over time. And so I say that to say that the needs that we provide and the resources that we have a tendency to grow over time and or are cyclical. Right. I would imagine 15 years from now, we more than likely will have to have a seasoned, person's type of ministry to make sure that the elderly in our church are taken care of and in our community. Our church happens to be really interesting in that there is a Hispanic American community behind our church. There is a Korean church of 2,000 people down the street. Their Temple Ramat Zion is around the corner from our church. And so do you get where I'm going? It is so eclectic, right? Of the variety of people who can come. So what we try to do is we try to have a lot of community events that are for everybody. I know this, I hope this is not offensive to anybody, but we put a lot of it under the Community Development Center so that it doesn't have a Christian name on it, because for us, all we really want to do is show you the love of God. And so if you come to the Christmas extravaganza where we put snow all over the parking lot for kids who have never seen snow and give out toys to the kids and to the homeless and pick families to do Christmas for, we could care less what color you are, what language you speak, actually what religion you are, whether you're Muslim, Catholic, Buddhist, we don't care. We just really want you to see the love of God and know that there's a place that you can come where you won't be judged and whoever you are will be accepted.
All houses of worship should be like that. All houses of worship should be that way.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think you are illustrating beautifully just how responsive our faith organizations are in LA County to the needs of our incredibly diverse community. And I don't want to toot LA County Library's horn, but I believe we approach providing service to our communities in much the same way. It's what do you need and how can we get it for you? And as you mentioned, we don't care what denomination you are, what your background is. We take everybody is welcome, and that's how it is for your organizations as well, which I think is wonderful. So moving on, I wanted to onto our second question. This is for everyone on the panel. What does a thriving and successful space look like in your faith/organization? And feel free to jump on in. Professor Humphrey, I'm sorry, Dr. Humphrey, did you want to share?
A thriving, successful place for me, for us as pastors of our church, I think would be that the totality of everything I just mentioned is felt by every person who walked in the door. And because you cannot control everybody, and nor should you, when you invite everybody, you invite a multiplicity of people and thoughts and ideologies and spiritual doctrines and all the things. And so a healthy, thriving place is where every person who walks through the door says, oh my God, I feel like I'm home. And if I need something, I feel safe enough to ask. Right now, we're in the middle of the strike. The writer's strike is over, but the SAG strike is still going on. And of course, this is Los Angeles. So many people, right, are impacted financially because of the strike and are out of work or furloughed or what have you. And so one of the things we did was we started giving out gas cards and food cards, right, for those who are being impacted by the strike. And a couple of people came up and they were like, I don't go to this church. Is it okay? I have a need. And then somebody, before I could answer, somebody said, our church doesn't care. You don't have to be a member here. Just go talk to the secretary. She'll give you one. And I thought, man, as a pastor, that's my heartbeat, right? Where everybody knows that the resources are applicable to anyone. I also think in addition to feeling like it's home and anything that we have or anything we can do is applicable to anyone, is that people feel like it's theirs. Right? That it's not the pastor's church. You know what I mean? It's not that denomination's church. This is a part of my community, and I'm part owner of the atmosphere that we set and the level of acceptance and understanding and love that we give, that I'm part and parcel to that as well. And so to me, that's a healthy, thriving place where there's no judgment, just love, and everybody feels responsible to give that as well as receive it.
So I would say that increasingly that mosques, Islamic centers, masjids, one of the big things that became apparent through the pandemic and just in general was the mental health needs of congregations and communities. And so we've seen partnerships between mental health organizations, Department of Mental Health, and also we have organizations in the Muslim community that cater particularly to the needs of congregants from those communities. So Ummah Clinic in South LA and other places that are able to partner with mosques. So I think it's for us, sometimes the mosque or the mosque is the house of worship, and then services. I've seen a lot of mosques build partnerships, but I would say just the uptick in mental health challenges for each generation too. I remember a meeting where I was at the mosque, and we were talking about teenagers, and then someone said, well, you know, we should have programs for seniors. So now there's a health program at that particular mosque, since I go to different mosques throughout the county. And it's been really important to understand how much these places you may not always get mental health services at the mosque. But it also, and I wanted to point this out, that very often mental health education opens up the door to access services because of stigma attached, because in certain realities, accessing mental health services could have a stigma attached to it. And I think that's really important for all of us to be aware that what can we do? It's not just if you have a counselor there and they offer services that people will jump to utilize them. I have found that there's really a need. And that's what's so beautiful about houses of worship, is they can speak the language, not just whether it's Arabic, Chinese, Korean, whatever, but they can speak the faith language of that community. And that can be really a big part of destigmatizing access to mental health. So I just wanted to mention that that's really important, is accessing mental health services that are culturally competent and relevant. I was on a call earlier this morning with the district attorney's office around mental health services and LA County, and thinking about, one of the questions was, well, are the counselors people that the community can relate to? Because it's not just, so I think as places of education and preparation for services, I think that's really important. So not just religious education, but education around mental health. We've seen also basic needs around nutrition, screening. Health screening is so important. I know my mother had a stroke and had high blood pressure, and, you know, being able to access, and I think that's what's really important, because you might reach people who may not feel comfortable going to the doctor, not necessarily that there's stigma, but as Dr. Humphrey was saying, it's about access too. I was just thinking about the mosque that I was at the other day for Friday prayer. I mentioned Friday is the day that our congregational prayer is held, and I had to wait for a ride. I don't remember why I was waiting for a ride. I think my kids took the car and I had to get a lift, but I was waiting for a ride, and I saw a woman who was an unhoused neighbor, and she wanted to get a ticket to go back. She wanted to go back home. She had come to LA. Things weren't working out for her. So I saw the mosque secretary on the phone booking a ticket for her. So sometimes it's very formal services, and sometimes it's just informal services. I actually don't know if that woman was Muslim. I don't know if she wasn't Muslim. But I know that when I also teach at the mosque, that we would have regulars that would come, and they would share with me that sometimes they were housed, sometimes they weren't housed that week, and the mosque was a place for them to find and get access to housing, but it was also a place for them, similar to libraries, to just have a safe, clean, welcoming place for the day where they could feel comfortable, and people would be open to them. And we don't ask, where are you going next? What did you bring with you? Clothing is another big need that a lot of mosques provide for people. I know the mosque that I go to is, you know, a number of those mosques. So I just wanted to share the healthiest environment for any organization, I think, and this is the test for all of us, is whether we're creating intergenerational spaces. Because I think you can have services for, most mosques now see a huge need for daycare. So you have some services that will take care of the very young children, and then you have services that will take care of seniors, and you have services for young families. Is there a place, and I think that's the challenge for all of us, where we're all actually mixing with each other and spending time with each other and learning from each other? And the research shows that those are the healthiest long-term houses of worship across, that's from a study of synagogues from the Jewish community. So it doesn't matter what your house of worship is or your faith community, but do you have the ability to do more intergenerational and multi-generational work? together, and maybe you just have fun and have a potluck, but do we have those experiences, and are we building them intentionally in the design of our organizations and services?
Now, I certainly would concur that I think a successful space is one that people feel comfortable coming to, regardless of whether, if they're a member of that faith tradition or not. I think it's essential, the whole idea of hospitality, absolutely essential today, absolutely essential. And I think that there can be partnerships. I know at least one of our parishes in Hollywood recently, a Protestant congregation partnered with our Catholic parish there to put on a community blood drive. I think the Protestant church actually ran it, but our space was larger, so they used our social hall to have this type of community drive. And I think that shows people that people of diverse religious traditions can work together for the common good. And I think that's something our society sorely needs today.
And, just to kind of speak to what Father Alexei was saying, Father Alexei and I have been at many, many events together. in the mosque, in the church, or in a synagogue, or LA City Hall, actually. And something I want to mention really quickly, at least in the Muslim community, particularly in Ramadan, I just wanted to share with you, like, we have very different holiday schedules. In the Muslim community, Ramadan is a month where people fast, and they have a high level of congregation in the mosque to break the fast. But now that season for Muslims has become our interfaith season. Yeah. So during the month of Ramadan, we will break fast at the mosque, and then we'll have an open house. And just as an example, one of the things that I think is so important is that in LA County, across all the denominations, all of our faith communities, we do a lot of peace building between our communities. So maybe about 2 months ago, I went to Friday prayer at the mosque, and then I saw 15 young Jesuit priests who had come from another state to visit LA, because LA is an example where so apparently on a regular basis, this professor from Harvard who I actually taught with on the East Coast, he brings his students to this mosque. And I thought that was a really beautiful example of not just is it that we offer services, but we do gatherings between people of different religious traditions. And I think right now, more than ever, peace building, conversation, understanding, learning about each other. And something I think we can't fail to mention is that houses of worship a couple of days ago was the 5th anniversary of the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and that mosques in Los Angeles, churches, synagogues have all been targeted across the country. But one of the beautiful things is when a mosque, a church, or a synagogue has been targeted, we show up for each other. Mm-hmm. So the press conference that Mayor Garcetti had in the mosque included people of every religious tradition in Los Angeles, and we show up for each other when there's a synagogue that's been targeted. So I think more than ever, showing up for each other so that love overcomes hate is a big function of our worship spaces, not just for our community, but for the health and the safety of everyone in LA County.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If it's okay, I would like to go back to something that was said earlier with regards to mental health. Traditionally, there's been a stigma about mental health and religion, right? And the Department of Mental Health has been extremely intentional about the intersectionality between mental health and your spiritual health, and their desire to have faith leaders engage in that conversation and also be a resource. And so I sit on a couple of boards for the LA Department of Mental Health, and our church is highly involved with regards to that. I think that is also what makes a place safe, is when you can say, I'm not well, right? And if the synagogue or the church doesn't have the help that's needed, that there are resources that they're in partnership with, that they can get the help for you, right? And that's another thing that I think really, really creates a safe environment for people to come to, which makes all of this even more fantastic. So I'm excited to meet the two of you, because partnership, I don't have to be great at everything. I can surround myself with great people, and I look incredible, right? Because I have relationship capital.
That's why I hang out with Najeeba.
You're a wise man. You really are. But relationship capital is better than money in some instances. Yes.
Yeah.
Because what I don't have, my partners in ministry, my partners in spiritual spaces have what I don't have. I don't have to create the will every single solitary time because someone else next to me may have already created it. That's all.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Department of Mental Health here is offering grants for houses of worship and to put together programs to assist people with this.
Yeah, I believe
in
so.
need. Yeah, yes.
And you, speaking about how you help your community with issues such as mental health, which is incredibly sensitive, right? It's very vulnerable to go to someone and talk about what you're going through. I think it illustrates just how you're such a trusted community space for the members of the citizens of Los Angeles County. I just have to share that we at the library as well, we get customers coming in, especially after the pandemic, asking for service referrals, for financial assistance, for health. It's just, again, it takes a lot of humility to approach someone and talk about the most vulnerable things that you're going through. Can you speak about any kind of trends that you've noticed, especially after the pandemic and just all of the challenges that brought to our community members? If you can just describe some of the inquiries that you've gotten, or any kind of support requests from the community.
I would say that, oh, please, did you want to go ahead, Dr.?
Oh, go.
Just briefly, I will keep it really brief. I think there is a lack of connectedness. One of the things that was interesting is that going online did give more access around issues of people who have mobility challenges or people who have other challenges. I do think one thing, particularly for the Muslim community, that is going to be in Los Angeles a big challenge is really our seniors that are isolated, physically isolated, emotionally isolated, because so many children, and particularly for many Muslim communities, not all of them, but it's, one could imagine or characterize our communities as very close-knit, as diverse as they are racially, spiritually, and otherwise, very close-knit communities. So particularly for seniors who had an expectation that in that part of their life, they would be surrounded by children and grandchildren, and then the realities of life, and your child is halfway across the country and you're by yourself. So I would just mention that I think that has been and will be a big challenge for our communities. And because some of them are more recently immigrated, they're not as established. How do you build and engage and think about the realities of seniors and their need for, whether it's healthcare, but really around socialization and social networks. And so I don't know if my colleagues would reiterate or add to that, but I'll pass it on to them.
Yeah, I think the amount of depression that we saw during and after the pandemic was at an all-time high. And I think the statistics will show that as well, you know, with research. The amount of requests I received for people who just said, I don't want to get out of bed. I need therapy. I need something, you know, and sometimes people didn't even know what it was, and they couldn't even define it as depression. They just knew something in them didn't have that upward lift anymore. And so one of the things that I think we really had to buckle down and do, we used to have a counseling center in our church, like we're licensed therapists, because here's the other piece. We have to know what we don't know. And be honest about what we don't know. You know, we go through training, we go to school and all that from a spiritual perspective, to be clergy, to be pastors, to be all the things. But some things are above, and I'll say playfully, above our pay grade with regards to clinical depression and suicide. You have to be trained in those things. I don't care how well you pray. You need, sometimes you need the professional to come in and do professional diagnosis. Sometimes meds are needed. And again, that intersection of, oh, God will take care of it versus you actually have a chemical imbalance and medicine will help you and you will feel better, needs to be said. And sometimes there's been a stigma around that, particularly in church. And so we've done, I really believe, a really great job at breaking that stigma by providing therapists that are not secretive, but very, very protective. We had a whole nother door that if you wanted to come see the therapist, you could come up another door so nobody from the congregation saw you go upstairs and go see the therapist. And just to hold that privacy in great honor, because even though we have young people, millennials, I was really surprised by how great the depression impact was of the pandemic and that isolation, particularly for single people. Because if you think about it, they were not touched, they were not hugged. Even if you lived in the same household with your family or your kids, touch is so important so that I know I'm alive. But we had single people who didn't live here, moved here because, they came to go to school or whatever, and they're in an apartment by themselves for, essentially a couple of years, I'll say it that way, and had not been touched and not feeling alive or seen. And so the impact to the answer to your question was great. And we did a lot to partner with the Department of Mental Health. It just so happens that one of the assistant deputy directors of LA Department of Mental Health goes to my church. And so I actually have access and knowledge in some spaces that, I can just call up, hey, have this issue, can you help, you know what I mean, or what are the resources? But I think that's critically important for a safe space to be able to say I'm not okay, and to have that heard and received and somebody moved to do something about it. It was very specific to me. My child happened to be suicidal during the pandemic, and so having been sexually assaulted at her high school, and so that whole scenario, even though I was already engaged with the Department of Mental Health, threw me into a whole deeper facet of it, so that I could be fully aware and have access and resources for my own child.
Thank you for being brave enough to share that story with us about your child. I'd like to add another aspect about stigmatization. I mentioned earlier that several of the churches here in El Segundo, where I live, have pooled their resources to help those in need in El Segundo. El Segundo wasn't, when we first started this, I was one of the founders of this, we started this in 1996. Wasn't known as a place where there might be people that were in need, but they were here. And so we've tried to become very proactive in trying to prevent people from becoming homeless here in town. And there's still, El Segundo is somewhat of an isolated community. It's right close to the airport here, but it's its own municipality, own civil government, own school district, own police and fire department, that type of thing. But I'm confident that, especially amongst the seniors, they are afraid to ask for help because they don't want to be seen having to ask for help. And so there has to be a way, because it's a small town, 17,000 people here. People know one another. And you were talking about, I saw you going upstairs to the therapist. Well, if they see someone coming over to the food pantry, they say, aha, see? So there's got to be a way of meeting their needs and keeping their dignity at the same time.
Thank you for sharing that. That's absolutely important. I completely agree with you. I wanted to circle back a bit because we brought up COVID-19 and it had such a huge impact on everyone, obviously. And I just wanted to inquire, it disrupted our service at the libraries tremendously. We were known, as places of worship are as well, a community gathering space, and to have that gone for essentially 2-3 years, it impacted everyone on so many levels. As you mentioned, the mental health, just the idea of community changed, right? Because we had to find new venues to meet with each other, because there is a power in joining together physically and being one, right? So I wanted to ask you, what were the challenges that you faced and how did you address it to provide service to your communities during the pandemic?
I'll just jump in here. I have two small congregations where I serve as pastor. One, for the longest time, I simply Zoomed Sunday services for them. And the other, and we worshiped on the lawn here, outside, for months. It was a pain. I confess to you, we're into confession. I confess to you all, it was a pain, but it was worth it. It was worth it because people needed that. They needed some sense of community and of being together and receiving the sacraments from our tradition. And it was important to do that. And I'm very thankful that we did it.
I think most mosques in LA County for worship services moved online. So we would do like, what was really hard, I mentioned the Ramadan, the month of fasting, where almost every night we break fast in congregation. Then we have extra prayers after in the evening. So Ramadan is really a time when we spend so much time communally either praying. It's also a time of heightened social services that we give back. So we had 2 Ramadans in COVID. That was very, I think, it was very difficult for communities, because I remember like we would be like, okay, let's Zoom tonight, and let's Zoom and Zoom and Zoom. As I mentioned, I think there's some really wonderful things that did come out of the Zoom culture. So now most mosques, they didn't all do this before. Now they all most mosques that can and have the capacity, not every mosque, I mentioned there's a asymmetry of resources, but those that can will also simulcast their prayer or their services or their education. So now for people who can't, so in some ways, COVID opened up the doors to allow more participation by people that don't have access, whether it's mobility issues from disability, or maybe it's mobility issues of just being able to leave your job, you know, especially if something is in the middle of the day. So I do think that was in some ways a gain for organizations to build that technology and understand how to use it and give access. And I think that's a permanent change of the religious landscape. And others could speak to that, but at least for most mosques, most of the mosques that I'm aware of continued, if they had a food pantry, that was the one thing that they continued, was the sources of feeding people who were in need. So the Islamic centers that I know, a couple of them, they shut down their religious services, moved on to Zoom, but they kept feeding people. And that was, I thought, a beautiful example of that reality, because people became people were dependent on that weekly food service of groceries that basically fed them and their families for a week. I would say that one of the other really big challenges that I was going to share is particularly for Muslim communities, we've seen an uptick whenever there's a global crisis in refugees and asylum seekers. We've also, because we're located LA County closer to the southern border, the diversity of unaccompanied minors has gone up. So now we're seeing unaccompanied minors who are East African. We're seeing unaccompanied minors who, when there was a large transfer of Afghans to the US, and some of this happened during pandemic. So I wanted to just kind of also talk about what it means to come in that status to Los Angeles County as a refugee or asylum seeker, and that there's many opportunities to volunteer with your house of worship to welcome people, whether it's through organizations like the TIA Foundation that serves and works with recent immigrants. And I think one of the realities, and something I wanted to share really quickly, is people who had gone through trauma, re-experiencing trauma through COVID, we lost, there were many communities, and we know COVID disproportionately impacted communities of color. So that means if you have a very ethnically diverse community, that means that you were disproportionately impacted by COVID, of people not just losing jobs, but losing their lives. And so I think that re-traumatizing for certain communities that had just come through trauma is something I think mosques and Muslims are still finding ways to address. And I don't think there's enough of a robust system, because very often the people you want to depend on as volunteers who can serve that community are just recently coming themselves. So how do you grow capacity to work with particularly people who are just acclimating to this country? And particularly, I just want to mention that's a feature of Los Angeles County, of our location, of our diversity, and of our welcoming, hopefully, attitude towards immigrants and asylum seekers. And I think that's beautiful. And it also particularly during, and I want to mention that many churches have been leading in being partners in this work. Synagogues have been very open. And so and they're open to people of other religious traditions. So we've seen Muslims helped by churches. We've seen Muslims helped by Jewish congregations. And I think that's a really beautiful part of the story of immigrants, particularly asylum seekers and refugees who are fleeing violence and coming to Los Angeles County, that interfaith component of hospitality from other communities, not just from their own faith community.
Yeah, I think it's CLU, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, that puts together these groups of various denominations and ilks of believers to meet these buses when they bring these, unfortunately, transport these migrants here and just dump them.
Same for us with regards to the online production. We had an online.
Oh no, it looks like we lost Dr. Humphreys. Hopefully we will get her back connected. But in the meantime, I don't know if you had any more to share about the pandemic and kind of how you pivoted or adapted your services during that time.
I would just like to continue on the same line that Najeeba developed there. Catholic parishes are divided as to whether or not to continue live streaming services or not. I particularly believe in it. I think it's absolutely essential. And the people that we are reaching from here, from my parish here in El Segundo, many of them are not our own people that for one reason or another don't come to church physically anymore, but people all around the world. And I think that's another aspect of being hospitable, of opening yourself to other people whom I don't for a moment think that all these people are Catholic that are watching, but they're searching for something. They're searching for something, and we're trying to provide that for them.
Yes, I mean, we can't escape the irony of we're on a Zoom call right now. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
and you're
with the
recording
challenges,
it, so it's going to be available to anyone. Yes.
Yeah. And that opens up, as Najeeba mentioned, just so many possibilities. So along with the challenges, there was also, a silver lining.
No, I agree.
I do think that one of the challenges that a lot of communities of faith did deal with was a decrease in their financial support.
Yeah.
So just because I was at a seminary and trained pastors, and I just wanted to point that out. So whatever nonprofits, just to remember that churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, gurdwaras are all nonprofits. So the trends that you saw across the nonprofit sector in terms of a dip and maybe a focus more on emergency services. So if you had, for instance, the capacity to do emergency services, to hold vaccination clinics. Oh, that was something I wanted to mention too, that churches, mosques, and synagogues became sites for vaccination clinics. And so healthcare during the pandemic, I know that I actually showed up at a number of churches in the parking lot, again, like you were mentioning outside, doing that kind of, I think during the height of the pandemic, those religious sites, synagogues, mosques were some of the first to offer and work with government partners.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really powerful, and also helped to do education on COVID. I don't know if we all remember, we didn't know what was going on in the beginning of COVID, and that the first place that many people in many Muslim communities, the one institution that people go to is their mosque and probably their library as well, right? But the mosque in particular became a center for health education and pandemic related healthcare services.
Mhm.
Excellent. And thank you. We're so happy that Dr. Humphreys joined us again.
Sorry about
This is no, that's technology, right? No big deal. Did you want to add to what we were discussing, Dr. Humphrey? I think you were in the middle of the point and then you dropped out.
Right. I'm like, what happened here? Again, our production was before pandemic, but of course it had to raise its game, during the pandemic. And fortunately, we had enough technical people to kind of manage it. And we would it was really hard speaking to an empty auditorium,
Yeah.
Of 600 seats, and the energy that you get from people.
Mhm.
So you have to have enough energy, not only for yourself and for speaking, but to kind of fill the room so that kind of energy comes back to you. So that was different. But the amount of people who were online soared tremendously. It was as if people were looking for spirituality in a level that they hadn't before, which is kind of interesting, because I don't know if the rest of my co-laborers in spirituality here have noticed that when there's a crisis, when there's a tragedy of sorts, people find their way into spiritual places, and then things have a tendency sometimes to settle down, and then we get back to the norm, and we get back to our old habits and patterns. And so our online presence, while it is, it was stellar then, and it came to an incredible level now, the amount of people watching, has dissipated. And the number online and the number in the house doesn't even remotely equate to the numbers during the pandemic. But that's how we stayed alive. And then we just used the parking lot for like Easter services, or our sacraments, communion. We'd have people drive around.
Drive through.
Lot, drive through. And then we had prayer services on the parking lot. You know what I mean? Where pull up and you're in your car and somebody's on a speaker, so that we could just pray together, so people could know that they were still in community. And then we set up. We partnered with the Department of Public Health. We did COVID shots on a round the clock, around the quarter basis of once the shots were available, the vaccines were available. We just set up shop, and anybody in the community could come and, get the COVID shot if they wanted to. And that was another way that we wanted to make sure we helped our community stay safe.
That's wonderful. Did anyone want to follow up on just some of unexpected things that came from the pandemic? I think we're still sorting through our feelings of everything that happened during that just chaotic time.
I would just add about the technology that Professor, you just mentioned. I don't know your seminary training, but mine never involved technology. And it was certainly a learn by doing, and thanks be to God for the younger people in the congregation who assured me we could do this. And I said, well, I'm going to take a leap of faith here, and I'll follow your example, and it worked.
I'm pretty sure I have a plate in my head that anytime, that's probably why the computer just went dead. I probably get a little too close. It just went cattywampus.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, thank God for the younger generation who, at age 2 knew how to work an iPad.
Exactly.
So that was really, really a blessing. So yeah.
So something I would add is, just because I happened to study this for one of my book articles, was we saw a really beautiful uptick in service during the pandemic. So whether it was locally young, I mentioned seniors that were isolated. So there were churches where young people would prepare meals and drop them off to seniors. So as that's just one example. I remember I was thinking about this, because again, I don't remember if we didn't have there was no playbook for a global pandemic. And I remember that I couldn't find masks in the beginning of the pandemic. And at that time, I had a 14-year-old and a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. And I was at the point where they're in LA, they're in schools, public schools in LA County. And the first masks I got were sewn by an Episcopal church here. I live in Little Rock. So someone from the church, because I have very severe asthma. And so I was terrified. I did not leave the house for a year. I think I was in a small bubble with my brother in in Long Beach. But it was really powerful that I look back at that and I thought, you know, the first masks were sewn by a group of women at an Episcopal church that I knew from before pandemic because of the work that people like Father and Alexei and I did. And I think those are really beautiful stories, and sort of how we helped each other too. I think there was a lot of trauma and there was a lot of helping each other, and the helping again for people of different religious backgrounds. It wasn't that I'm just going to help my people, but, you know, I think on Facebook I put, you know, I really need masks. I need to go shopping. I need to get some groceries for my children. And someone literally the next day, the pastor's wife, the priest's wife from the local Episcopal church that I'm friends with, said, listen, I'm going to come by. I'm not going to see you. I'm just going to drop the masks off. Come get them. I'm going to put them at the bottom of your stairs at your house. And, you know, those were the first masks, and we wore them. They were cloth masks made by the congregants, and we wore them for a couple months because there was a time that you couldn't find masks. You couldn't find, what was it? The disinfectant. I mean, there were just so many things that were...
Hand sanitizer.
So those were, you know, things that were necessary for survival became commodities. And I think our houses of worship and our faith communities really banded together to make sure to get, you know, and I'm otherwise was mobile and able to access. So imagining people that had less capacity for being able to access things, I do think our houses of worship became, or our faith communities became, very pivotal in those services. Yeah, so I know some have faith communities where they still have, like, there's one room or closet where they're like, that was from the pandemic. We still have all that stuff. 1,000 bleach bottles.
Hang on to those masks. Hang on to those masks. You don't know. Yeah. You know, Najeeba, you just reminded me that I remember during the height of the pandemic, the Buddhist Suu Kyi Foundation, their charitable foundation, called me and asked if I knew of any parishes, or anyone for that matter, that needed masks. They had spare masks, and they were willing to bring them here if I needed them. That's really an outreach.
Yeah, I think the churches were extremely pivotal, and all the various religious organizations, because I laugh because, you know, we had a church of, I don't know, 500-600 before the pandemic. So we have a warehouse full of supplies, right? Cleaning supplies, of which toilet paper was in abundance. I don't know who before the pandemic ordered all that doggone toilet paper, but there were shelves of toilet paper. And I guess you have 500 or 600 people coming through, you need a lot of toilet paper. Well, nobody's at church, so all the toilet paper's in there. So they got phone calls on the church answer machine. I was just wondering if the church had any toilet paper. Yeah, actually we do. Feel free. And then I, like my sister here, I have asthma. I got COVID for 3 months. I was sick because of my lungs, and had people dropping food off for my family because I was in the bed, breathing machine. They sent x-ray machines to my house because I didn't want to go to the hospital because people were not coming out of the hospital. So I'm like, I'm not going. And so I have great doctors who came by the house or sent x-ray machines, but scary time. And out of that, a level of compassion and community was, the level was raised because people got accustomed to, oh, so-and-so family has COVID. We're going to do a meal train, right? And so many people are going to drop off meals every day until they're able to tend for themselves. And so the rise in community has been wonderful to see. And I think it was there before, but crisis always pushes you to the limit of your capacity for the most part. And you see what you're really made of what your organization is really made of. And I was really proud that the body of believers of all religions really stepped up to the plate.
That's right.
To help each other.
Thank you for sharing. So I just wanted to pivot for the moment. We just talked about all of the measures that were taken to provide better accessibility to services during the pandemic. Currently, though, what are some of the barriers or challenges to accessibility that you face, whether it's physical, it's to your physical space, or to the services that we provide to our communities?
So I do think that is a big, a really important question. And there's different kinds of accessibility. There's the physical accessibility of the buildings. So as I mentioned, a lot of mosques, there's not one standard architecture. They are often adapted, they're adapted use from another function. So I do think physical accessibility remains a challenge to a number of our mosques. And very often, because of financial capacity, the adaptability and the use needs to go further. And so I do think that that's definitely something that, you know, is an area of improvement. The other accessibility is having, whether it's religious education or other forms, be accessible. And that also, interestingly enough, because of Zoom, it provided for people who have challenges around physical accessibility, but also other forms, for instance, being able to close caption. And so you can watch, so technology opened the capacity for us to be able to have a sermon where someone who needs, if you don't have the services in your mosque, where during the sermon someone is doing American Sign Language, you're able to caption it. So what I think is a growing need, and in many ways the pandemic kind of opened up this conversation in a deeper way, because of issues of accessibility on the Muslim community. So
I apologize.
The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding says that probably 1 in 3 Muslim families is dealing with an issue of disability, and that's probably the same across the board. And one of the things that I think we're working on as a community is figuring out how we deal with the array of disabilities. And I wanted to point out, for instance, there's organizations, if people are interested, one called Muhsin, MUHSEN. There's another organization called the Global Deaf Muslim Community. So there are many communities that are developing, and there's more work that has to be done. There's a really big thrust in our community. For instance, I have friends and others that are recognizing the need, for instance, to deal with issues of autism, and how do you have service, how do you even do your religious services in ways, or religious instruction for many children in the United States. Muslims get their education through a Sunday school, as I talked about. Is Sunday school accessible for children of neurodiversity and background? And so anyways, I just want to kind of mention that I think what we're finding is a development of organizations, and that is, I think, a cutting edge area that we need to be focusing more on. And in particular, invisible disabilities, meaning the fact that, you know, mental health is health. And I think that's just something I wanted to put out there too, is mental health is health, and being able to do more work to recognize that there isn't a set of challenges that are acceptable, and then others that are less in their importance, and getting to a place where it's not just in faith communities, but across our society, where we just understand that mental health is a form of health. It is health, and that when people are looking for access to services, to whatever it may be, that we understand the barriers should be removed for access for everyone. And so I was just going to mention that as well. And I think it's a growing area for society and a growing area for our faith community.
And that's not simply your faith community, Najeeba, but all of our faith communities. And I think this could be a prime focus for interreligious dialogue and partnerships now.
Great. I also think, thank you for bringing up the autism thought. We had what we call a harvest festival on Sunday for the kids. And one of the moms called me later that night, and she said, it was wonderful. She started with the positive. She said, it was wonderful. It's absolutely awesome. You did an amazing job. She says, but there were 4 kids who are on the spectrum, and it was way too much stimulus for them. And one of my children were part of that group. And then there were some other moms, and she said she could see the frustration on their faces that we hadn't thought about them. And aside from breaking my heart that we hadn't, but it never crossed my mind. I was so grateful that she was willing to voice her concern, because now, like, we had staff meeting immediately a couple of days afterwards, and immediately there's a Christmas extravaganza coming up, or holiday extravaganza, excuse me. And And, already there's a whole section that's going to be set apart with a different level of stimuli, for those children who are on the spectrum, so that they too can have a good time and so that their parents don't feel worried. But when we talk about making those adjustments on the fly, right, I think our houses of worship ought to have that level of flexibility as well, right? That when something comes up, instead of, well, we don't deal with that. No, we're human. We deal with it all, because humans come with everything. How can we accommodate? How can we provide resources? And how can we make people feel safe? That was one. And the second thing I think is after the pandemic, one of the things that I really noticed is that the building is dark. 90% of the time, we have this huge, massive 20,000 square foot building that is utilized 10% of the time. And if you divide up the hours, I'm talking about not the office space, but the auditorium, the number of hours versus the mortgage, those services are so expensive, right? And so what has happened after the pandemic is we have a couple of Hispanic American churches who we are sharing our space with now. And let me just tell you, the way they have service with horns and dances and flags. I came downstairs one day from our service and they were having their service, and they were like, Aki, 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 Aki. And I was like, oh, no. I'm headed out. And then Aki, Aki. So I'm like, okay, I go in and I'm like, whoa, this is amazing. And so the ability to learn something new, right? And to share and to cohabitate in a space not only helps us, but after the pandemic, they didn't have a space. They lost their space after the pandemic. So those are other ways in which just being able to come together and with those of different ways of worshiping, we can join hands and say, hey, we can help each other in this space.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
That's such a lovely, lovely sentiment. And we're heading close to our time, so I want to respect our panelists' time. But I wanted to close out maybe to give kind of a personal touch and to learn a little bit more about you, if you're comfortable. We've spent this whole evening talking about kind of like a sacred space and places that we go for solace and to find kind of like an escape. What is that place for you personally? Is it in a house of worship? Is it nature? Could it be a library, perchance? If I don't know, maybe I don't know. But if you'd like to share,
no pressure, right? No pressure.
I think for me, it's water. Yesterday was my birthday.
And happy belated birthday!
Thank you. My husband took me to this place called Terranea, which is in Palos Verdes, overlooking the ocean and what have you. And we just took a walk down to what was called Terranea Cove, and I just sat there. It's the sound of the ocean. It's the waves. It's the calming. I don't know about you all, but my life is hectic and it runs at a frenetic pace. And just to be able to breathe, right? And sit and meditate and be quiet. And let my brain stop for a minute, which takes a minute, I might add, because I feel like my brain's on those waves often, just rolling. But for me, finding a place of quiet, and I believe God is in those quiet spaces. There's a scripture that says God wasn't in the earthquake, he wasn't in the whirlwind, but in that still small voice, in that space where you can quiet everything down and just, feel your own heartbeat for a minute and breathe. So I just sat there and did some breath work and just allowed myself to be still for a minute. And that's where I find solace. And that's where in many spaces I find God.
Oh, that's really beautiful. So for me, growing up, libraries were my safe place, especially when I was fasting and I couldn't eat during the day, during lunch. I didn't want to sit in the cafeteria, so I would go to the library. And there's a lot of Muslim kids that will tell you that story. Where if they went to public school, they would go to the library. And the relationship with the librarians is really important. And still to this day, I think books are a huge escape for me. So whether it's the physical book now that I carry or a book on my phone, but I do think escape and kind of into books. And I also think like one of the things that has grown for me is it's actually the sacred space of my own community. I was in the mosque on Friday, and the sacred the sanctuary where worship happens. So I can sit in that space. But what's really beautiful is it doesn't have to be just my community. I was in a synagogue doing an interfaith program last week. And when I walked into their sanctuary, it's different than a mosque. It's different than a church. But even when I was in that sanctuary, in our tradition, we're supposed to protect houses of worship, our own houses of worship. And the Quran, or the Muslim tradition, the Muslim scripture says anywhere where God's name is said, and it mentions the houses of worship of Jews, of Christians, monasteries, and other people. And I think that that's really beautiful, that it's not just for me, it's particular to my tradition. And I really think of libraries as sacred spaces because we really value learning. I remember we value books physically. I remember my mom, if I had a book that was on the spine and it was flat on the ground, it's not just my sacred book, the Quran, that I don't put on the ground, but it's just books in general. Like I have obviously a heightened relationship, but I can't imagine seeing a Bible or the Torah or any book, because books, that is one of the beautiful things about faith communities, is many of us are tied to scripture and text. And so instead of it being one that is condemning of others, I think the way I was raised is just books are such a sacred place, and that libraries become sacred for that reason too, in the protection of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. So those are some of the places, yeah, when I was in the synagogue last week, I was really struck by, there's something holy that's happening here. It's not my holy, it's not my tradition per se, but I just seeing people gather for worship and for love, and whether it's in the library, whether it's in a church, whether it's in a synagogue, whether it's in my mosque, it's really just beautiful to see people come together for the sake of sharing community, sharing food, and I hope to see Father Alexei again soon. He's well known in the interfaith community and very distinct and easy to find because of the very glowing white beard and hair. So.
And the hair. Okay. Thank you, Najeeba.
Okay, wait, I got to tell you though, you have a friend in me. You can't get rid of me now.
We don't want to get rid of you.
We have to be friends now. I've fallen in love with both of you, so thank you.
Aww. We're facilitating new friendships. I love this. This is great.
For me, it's actually both. I also identify with the water. I live, thanks be to God, 2/5 of a mile from the ocean. So I often go down towards the ocean or ride my bike along the beach path there. After the very formal worship services here, sometimes I will go down to the beach on Sunday afternoon, and I will also find God. I will connect with the divine there as well. And I also like libraries, although I have to admit, I haven't been in one lately, other than theological libraries. I like the library at Fuller Theological Seminary, for example, or even LMU, although Fuller is a better library than Loyola Marymount when it comes to theology. But don't tell anybody.
Any library we support, just like our interfaith communities support each other, libraries support each other as well.
There you go.
So no, that's lovely. That's a lovely sentiment. Thank you so much for sharing where your private places of solace are. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to share this lovely message, speaking of lovely things, that one of our attendees entered in the chat. So Eric says, what a beautiful message that each of you are relating about your faiths, and that their physical spaces and programs are expressing about being welcoming, in all caps, to all. All three of our organizations seem to have their collective fingers on the needs of the LA community and the world community as a whole. So please know that your work is so appreciated. And yes, this was a wonderful evening. I don't know about everybody else in the audience, but I feel very full. I feel like I have so many things to think about. This was a really amazing conversation. So I want to thank everyone, all of our lovely panelists for their participation. This was really beautiful. So yes, again, many thanks to our wonderful panelists, Dr. Andrea Humphrey, Right Reverend Alexei Smith, and Professor Najeeba Syeed. We are so grateful for your generosity of time and spirit.